I'd like to begin by welcoming you to The Therapy Show, a podcast series that seeks to explain the leading forms of psychological therapy to the average person. We will be doing this by interviewing the professionals who develop those modalities so we can better understand when to use them and how to get the most out of therapy. Today, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Stephen Hayes, who is Nevada Foundation Professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Nevada. Dr. Hayes is the author of 46 books and over 625 scientific articles. He's the developer of a new approach to human thought called Relational Frame Theory and has guided its extension to acceptance and commitment therapy, which is more commonly referred to as ACT. ACT is a popular, evidence-based form of psychotherapy that is now practiced by tens of thousands of clinicians all around the world. Dr. Hayes has been the president of the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapy and the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science. He was listed by the Institute of Scientific Information as the 30th highest impact psychologist in the world. Dr. Hayes is the author of many books, including Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, and my favorite, Acceptance and Mindfulness Treatments for Children and Adolescents, a Practitioner's Guide. I encourage anyone interested in his work to read Dr. Hayes' new book, A Liberated Mind, which was just released this month. Dr. Hayes, welcome to The Therapy Show.
I'm glad to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
I'm glad to have you. Can you start by telling us a little bit about your personal background and professional development that led you to develop ACT?
Yeah, I'm a behavior therapist and behavior analyst, really. We're pretty much over on the behavioral side of things, but then was trained also in early forms of CBT, especially REBT and Beck's approach. And I'm talking now in the 70s. But I really began my career with an interest in trying to figure out how to create a behavioral approach to language that would really work. I was convinced that what had been done up to that point just didn't really tell practitioners what to do, other than in really severely disturbed developmental disabilities kind of situations. But I kind of bogged down on that, and I had the great fortune of developing a pretty severe panic disorder, which gradually took over my life over about a 3-year period. Hid it pretty well from my colleagues and friends, but by the end, I really had a hard time giving lectures or talks or moving around freely, leaving the house, taking elevators, taking phone calls, etc. Going to restaurants, going to movies, almost everything, getting on a plane, almost everything was really, really hard because I was looking out for the arrival of anxiety and by that very effort, I think, actually producing it. There's a TED Talk people can find if you want to sort of see a bit of a brief story about that, but I finally hit bottom about 3 years into that, where I think I'm having a heart attack and then realize, no, it's just a new form of a panic attack. And inside that kind of hitting bottom moment where I didn't see any way forward, it opened up a door that was 180 degrees in the other direction, which was something that came out of my mouth in the middle of the night as I struggled with that heart attack that was actually a panic attack, which is something I actually said out loud. Had this almost out-of-body experience where I realized that I was following a voice kind of inside my head that was telling me to run and fight and hide from anxiety. And what came out of my mouth was, I don't know who you are, but you can make me hurt. You can make me suffer. I'll tell you one thing you cannot do is you can't make me turn from my own experience. You can't do it. And that was that turn 180 degrees in the other direction of sort of abandoning any interest in or attempt to control levels of anxiety or where my fearsome thoughts went. And really instantly I could feel the fog lift. I knew that was something really important. So you could almost say I had a spiritual kind of experience, I suppose. The TED Talk will maybe give a little more of an emotional sense of it. But I went back to my lab after that and I said, we need to research acceptance and mindfulness. They weren't in on my panic disorder, but I'm only talking about like 4 or 5 graduate students. And we began to do some of that research and very quickly found that we could get traction with clients, especially more complex and multi-problem clients, very quickly in ways that we hadn't heretofore. I did a series of studies then kind of looking at how CBT works and how CT works, cognitive therapy and cognitive behavior therapy. And does the cognitive model actually hold up? Nowadays, that's an expected thing. There's lots of research on it. Is reappraisal really why and all that kind of stuff. But at the time, there was really no component analyses, process analyses. They just weren't there. People looked to see, did your irrational cognitions move? And sure enough, they did, but not, did they really function as a mediator? That concept wasn't even in the field yet. So we did a series of studies, and in every case, the answer was no. The cognitive model doesn't explain why cognitive therapy works. If you bring it up to the present day, huge multi-site dismantling studies, such as the one done by the late Neil Jacobson, has led people like Keith Dobson, a major cognitive therapist, to say statements like cognitive intervention methods don't add anything to the outcome of cognitive therapy. Well, I kind of knew that's where that was headed in the 70s and early 80s. And so we did a couple quick randomized trials and showed that with the three we did, one in induced pain, one in diet and exercise, and one in depression. The depression one was a tiny little study done at the Center for Cognitive Therapy in Philadelphia. I sent my first doctoral student to get his training with Tim Beck, way before Tim Beck was what Tim Beck is now, which, by the way, puts the lie to the idea that the ACT people are like anti-cognitive therapy. We're not at all. These are our friends. It's that the model itself wasn't holding up, and that we thought we could do something that might be progressive, at least at the theoretical and model level. And when those three trials worked out, the only one that published was the depression one, and that was so that Rob Zettel could get a job. The rest went into the file drawer, even though it was successful, because I thought, if we're going to be coming in and saying things like, the stuff monks talk about, it turns out there's something powerful in there. You have to put yourself back to like 1982 and understand how crazy that would sound. There were practicing Buddhists who hid the fact that they're Buddhists just so that the feds would keep giving them grant money. Alan Marlatt did that. And if you know Alan, a friend, and somebody said for years, you got to stand up. Alan, he finally did towards the end, because mindfulness is now everywhere. But at the time, in the early 80s, it seemed kind of loony-toony, and especially from the behavioral point of view. And so for 15, 16 years, we didn't publish outcome studies. Case studies, yeah. But what we did was we developed measures, worked on actually philosophy of science because it's so tricky an area to walk into. We developed components. We tested the components. I developed the entire relational frame theory account, figured out a way to get language and cognition under the microscope of behavior analytic people like myself. And finally, in 1999, published the first ACT book. And it's now a big thing. As you mentioned in the intro, there's tens of thousands of people. There's several million books in print. There's 3,300 or so studies on it if you just restrict it to the ones that for sure are ACT, and you avoid things like mindfulness values and all that kind of stuff because it's a mix. If you look at the randomized trials, we're up over around 310 randomized trials in every area you can think of: mental health, behavioral health, prejudice, stigma, sports, recreation, managing your business. Just everywhere. But that's the journey we've been on. And essentially, our journey has been about trying to build a new form of behavioral psychology that's more adequate to the challenge of the human condition, and that can deal with issues of cognition and can understand the processes, at least a little more, the processes that lead lives to head downwards or upwards. And the model underneath ACT, called psychological flexibility, is a collection of 6 processes that do more with less in more areas than any other set, like in all of psychology, in my opinion. Sorry if it sounds like bragging, but that is, I think, what the data would show. And a whole lot of those processes are now not just in ACT, but in the whole set of newer forms of behavioral and cognitive therapy. And they link over to evidence-based therapies of all kinds, emotion-focused therapy, and some of the more evidence-based wings of psychodynamic work and so forth. That's where it's taken me, basically, from the rat lab to a panic disorder to a model that seems to go anywhere that human minds go.
It's interesting because in the early 80s, I was at Columbia studying Buddhism with Robert Thurman. And when you think about
Cool.
these ideas, how much they resonated with me. And I remember again thinking, yeah, this was new. Like this was a new way of thinking in Western academia. So I appreciate how it resonated with you.
Yeah, I'm a child of the 60s. And so I was exposed to the Eastern thinking that any child of the 60s would. I mean, Suzuki, Watts, people like that. And of course, psychedelics. I mean, psychedelics weren't just sex, drugs, and rock and roll. They were spiritual journey efforts by kids who didn't know how to manage it and made all kinds of cultural mistakes. But I mention it because now we're going back and we're actually, I hope, going to do it right now. And ACT is really very much involved in this new form of psychedelic therapy. But I do think I want to say when the Buddhism word comes up, I always want to say that all of the mystical wings of all the major wisdom and spiritual and religious traditions, they all modify how analytic, judgmental language works, whether it's silence or chants or koans or repeated prayers. They all do that. And there's a reason for that, because this new evolutionary kid on the block called human language affords all kinds of wonderful things in terms of problem solving and so forth, but it also turns your life into a problem to be solved, which is about as toxic an idea as you can put into a human being.
So how would you briefly explain ACT to a non-professional?
I'm having to do that in the popular books and writings and talks I'm giving, and I'm still a little bit of a geek, so it's hard for me. A Liberated Mind is my first real Big Five attempt to reach Big Five, meaning one of the five major trade book publishers. I've had one trade book that did really well, Get Out of Your Mind in Your Life, but that was kind of an accident. A guy at Time Magazine, the late John Cloud, picked it up and wrote about it in a 5-page story. And so it beat Harry Potter for one glorious week on Amazon. But I would say it this way. I would say your normal mode of mind that shows up when pain shows up, I bet you, is to defend or to run away. But there's no delete button in the nervous system, and the things we worry about and the things we've felt and the betrayals that have happened or the things we've done wrong will always be there because there's no eliminating memory. There's no taking away what's in our nervous system. And so what ACT is learning how to step up to your own experience and your own history in a way that's open and aware, but allows a little bit of space between you, a person with that history, and the impact of those thoughts and feelings and memories and bodily sensations that is sort of automatic and mindless, so that you get to make a choice as to what are the things you do when pain shows up or when self-criticism shows up or self-doubt. And when you are able to sort of see that with a little bit of separation and take what's of use and leave the rest, you can bring your attention into where you are right here, right now, inside and out, what the situation allows, what could work here, and focus on what would put into your next life moments the meaning and purpose that you would want to put into those moments. And if you can organize what you do around habits of these kind of values-based action, it gives you another way to go forward and to put some of what you might have learned from your difficult history. And that's what ACT is about. It's going to combine these kind of opening and more mindful processes with this attention towards values and the behavior change processes for the purpose of producing more psychological flexibility, more emotional agility, more ability to sort of be with yourself as a whole person, with your history as it is, and to carry all of that forward in a direction that brings meaning and purpose to you and that serves the lives of those you love and of the things that you want to see reflected in your life. So that's what ACT is. It's an evidence-based method of combining acceptance and mindfulness and commitment and behavior change processes for the purpose of producing a more flexible way of being with yourself and your history.
When and how did you realize that ACT would be an effective form of therapeutic intervention?
Well, I got up off the brown and gold shag carpet at 2 a.m. with my fake heart attack, knowing that my life had changed. I mean, I stood up aching. Apparently, I'd been there almost in a trance for a long time, but my much younger body had a hard time standing up. I remember that. Really a changed person. But wasn't a psychotherapy developer at the time, but as a person who was really interested in developing change methods broadly. And it was pretty broad. I mean, at the time I was doing research on things like environmental problems, how to get people to quit using excessive amounts of energy and crazy things for a clinical psychologist to do. But I was interested in how we can empower people to be more effective in the world in all kinds of different ways. At that point, we really knew. We knew that, okay, this is going to work. This is going to move some behavior in ways that doesn't fit what we've been talking about in the evidence-based therapies up to this point. At that point, you don't have John Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based stress reduction or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. You don't have DBT. You don't have metacognitive therapy. You don't have behavioral activation in the modern form that includes this kind of undermining of avoidance with people who are depressed, et cetera. So really, felt like we were out on an island. I knew others were coming because I could sort of sense its link to the 60s. My friend Paul Emmelkamp, an old curmudgeon in the CBT world, tells me, Hayes, what's really going on here is the hippies grew up. And actually, I think there's some truth to that. But I didn't think it was that progressive to come out and say, hey, the stuff monks have been talking about is really cool, and we ought to put it in the healthcare system. Why? Well, in part because there's more delivery systems within 50 miles of where you're sitting that are focused on that than there is probably group therapy sessions. I mean, there's more people doing more workshops on spiritual methods of all kinds, a lot of which overlap with some of these things. And nobody nominated a psychotherapist to be freaking gurus. Plus, I had really gotten very skeptical about gurus. It's a bit of an offshoot, but I want to mention it because it explains some of why ACT is like how it is, which is, I lived on a religious commune, but then I saw the leader of that commune, a guy named Kriyananda. You can look him up in the Wikipedia and see what I'm saying is true, who almost lost his camp because he was, I would say molesting is the right word, but every female in the freaking camp. And did it again, the old coot, about 20 years later, and he was like 80. But the first exposure I had to Zen Buddhism was from Joshu Sasaki Roshi, right after he came over from Japan and opened up a whole wing of Zen thinking. He was being sued at 100 years old for hitting on his female acolytes. So to my way of thinking, early on, I said, no gurus. I don't want them. So I was very cautious, and I've kind of had a lead from behind thing. I mean, the ACT stuff is huge, but there's more ACT books written by me, and I make sure that one of the things, if you get to be a recognized trainer in ACT, one of the very last things you do is you sign a values statement that you won't certify therapists or make proprietary claims. Why? Because as soon as you do it, as soon as you're giving the anointing, oh, you're the anointed ACT therapist, I know where that goes. That goes towards the same kind of hierarchical systems that create abuse everywhere you can see, and it's just not where science should go. So coming back to what you actually asked, we knew early on, but I kind of wanted to make this safe for the health system. And the way I thought we'd do it is by digging down to the processes of change, put a model out, even all the way down to a basic theory of language and cognition that now has several hundred studies behind it. And philosophy of science, for goodness sakes. Well, I thought that was really important because if you're going to put a model out, you're going to put out basic processes, you really have to have your feet firmly planted in terms of your assumptions, which is what philosophy of science is about. And by doing that, anybody can take these principles, and if you want to rename them, rename them. There's 15 different names for ACT right now. I mean, Susan David wrote a book on emotional agility. You read the introduction, it's an ACT book. But there's nothing in there that has ACT terms, and I don't care. I mean, that's good. That's how you put it in her case, business and industry. That's great. So we've figured out a way, I think, to avoid this kind of gurufication of bringing Eastern concepts into psychotherapy. And I hope, anyway, we've done a pretty good job of putting processes out there that will be useful to anybody interested in developing more powerful means of helping people.
So who's ACT most effective for, and why should people choose an ACT intervention?
It seems when you look at moderators, as best we can tell, that it's better with multi-problem, chronic problems. And I think the reason why is it's so fundamental. It gets into issues about who are you, sense of self, what are emotions, what are thoughts, how do you even relate to those things? What are your deepest, most precious values? That's pretty fundamental stuff. And people, when they have more minor problems, don't come in with an openness to that typically. So if you've got a single phobia or something, for goodness sakes, get somebody who can do our best validated exposure methods, period, and end of story. Now, ACT is part exposure for sure. One of the first things I wrote is it's an exposure-based technology, but it turns out that's what the data shows, that people essentially have to be open to conversations that are that deep and to experiences that go beyond simple, normal problem-solving mode of mind experiences. Now, if somebody's ready for it, if somebody wants it, if somebody's really interested in it, well, then sure. So there are ACT studies with sports and with running your business and really kind of nice ones, important ones, and over time being combined with new things that I think will really make an importance. I have a book coming out that walks through how we've combined ACT with the late Elinor Ostrom's Nobel Prize-winning core design principles for how small groups can work together in cooperative ways, for example. If anybody's interested in that, if they go to prosocial.world, they can see that and get some of those things for free. But back on track, I think the core principles apply anywhere that a human mind goes. But if you mean by ACT the sort of set of technologies that have emerged up around the psychological flexibility principles that go under that name, I would recommend it for people who have read a bit about it and they're sort of interested, it resonates, it feels right, or people who've been through other evidence-based therapies and things have not gone as well as they would want, that isn't all that they want. There's good data on that. The people who've, for example, been through our best evidence-based therapies and didn't get the outcomes they want, a very significant portion of those folks will respond to ACT. Or people who have multiple problems, that it isn't just I've got a single anxiety issue. It's got an anxiety issue and I'm depressed, or I've got substance abuse and I have odd perceptual experiences. Or finally, people are just chronic. If you struggled, you had this thing hanging around for a long, long time. All of those things, I think the data would suggest, and my experience would tell me, are kind of the special indicators as to how to find an ACT therapist. And if you actually put in, by the way, bit.ly, if you know bit.ly links, literally the words find an ACT therapist, you have to capitalize the word find, and ACT is capitalized all three letters. You'll see about 5,000 people all around the world who list themselves and their training experience, their background. We don't certify therapists, but we do have people list all of their training, who they've been supervised, where they've gone. You scan a few of those, you'll get a sense as who's new, who's not, and what kind of practice they do. So you can seek out an ACT therapist, and very likely in the US especially, there's somebody close by.
And that will be on my website as well.
Awesome.
I'll put that link. So what's the average length of treatment for somebody working with ACT?
Well, because it's principle-based, there's really not a good answer to that question. The randomized trials go from interventions with actual people in need, not laboratory interventions, that would range from 15 minutes or half an hour total to 28 sessions of individual therapy and 14 group sessions. Or here's a book, read it. Or here's a website, go there. Or here's an app, it might help you. So the psychological flexibility principles apply to everything. Basically, it's not just mental health, it's behavioral health, it's human prosperity. It applies to this moment right now between you and I. It applies to whatever's going on to the people who are listening to this right now. But ACT as a set of intervention techniques, which is really not what I think ACT is. I think of ACT as anything that is really carefully targeted and validated against the movement of psychological flexibility. The reason why it's such a wide range is there are protocols, for example, in primary care, of bumping people in the right direction as part of a 15-minute primary care visit, maybe with a follow-up phone call or two from a nurse, and really nice outcomes. I mean, no, it's not the same as a normal course of psychotherapy, but Sometimes people don't know. I mean, they go to their primary care physician with depression, let's say, and the person doesn't know, actually you could work on opening up to these feelings of sadness, for example, if that's what's going on with the person. And if you catch it early on, some of these little bumps and suggestions of self-help books and things that people might read are enough. Now, if somebody's dealing with, let's say, the normal kind of common cold of psychotherapy, not common cold, a specific one, but depression would probably be one of those, anxiety problems, or maybe a lesser group, but still important, some sort of substance use problem. If you're dealing with anxiety, depression, substance use, most of those studies are in the 10-session range, 8, 10, 12, with normal kind of 50-minute kind of thing. But in the modern era, there's so many outside supports, and they're so well validated now. There's almost 30 studies on books, apps, websites, that through adjuncts and so forth, you may be able to cut that down if that's too many for you. But that would be the normal expected course in a randomized trial, at least.
So what skills, habits, or tactics can patients and therapists adopt, either during their sessions or in between sessions, to improve the effectiveness of ACT?
Well, because there's 6 processes involved that are kind of flips of inflexibility processes. Each of them has a practice piece. I mean, people vary. They usually know something about the flexibility processes, but their mind doesn't know. You can recognize it, and you've experienced it. I'll give you an example. If you just ask people who lifted you up in your life powerfully, and think of anybody who really empowered you. And then if I just quickly ask 6 questions about that person, if you get somebody in mind, did you feel accepted for who you are? Were you constantly being judged, or is that far away? When they're with you, were they kind of with you, or are they looking at their watch? When your eyes met, did you see consciousness there, that they were clear, that they were with you and you're with them, and this kind of connection between 2 conscious people? Did what you care about matter to the person, or would they ride over that without a second thought? Could you be together in ways that fit the situation, or did it have to always be one way and up to the other person? Those are the 6 flexibility questions having to do with emotional openness, cognitive openness, attentional flexibility to the now, this more conscious or pure awareness sense of self, values, and actions being developed that fit your values. Well, if you know enough to pick somebody, and I'm guessing those 6 questions I asked, almost everybody had the same answers. If you know enough to do that, why don't you know enough to put those things into your life? Well, because you've got a dictator between your ears who's telling you to solve the problem by running, fighting, and hiding. Because when you feel something, that dictator says, oh, I don't want to feel bad, I want to feel good. Well, that's logical, that's sensible. It just turns out to be pathological. Because feelings don't come that way. Feelings come across a whole range of things. And guess what? Some of the places where you hurt are some of the places that you care. If your mother dies and you love your mother, you're going to feel sad. That love and loss package comes, it's like an Oreo cookie. And so you don't get treacle, you don't get sugar soup if you're interested in living a fully connected emotional life. So the skills that we teach and the ones that are practiced are to catch this variation that's already there around these 6 processes, to deliberately produce more variation, to show that people actually have capacity pretty quickly to notice their thoughts with a sense of distance and be able to look at them with a sense of equanimity, to experience their feelings, their memories, their bodily sensations, again, with a sense of openness and flexibility and so forth through the other processes. You already have some variability. You can build more in. You can experience as a range. And then what you need is that piece of, is this moving you ahead or behind? And get people to see when you're moving ahead. I just gave you an experience that would help you do that. I mean, do you want to be like the people who empowered you, or do you want to be like people who disempowered you? You pick. Well, that's a selection criterion. And then once you've got that, you're really close to evolving on purpose if you can get retention in there. Because if you have variation, selection, and retention, now we're really starting to change a system. So in a normal ACT protocol or a self-help book or whatever, there's going to be repeated practice of going out and finding situations, opportunities to practice diffusion skills, watching your mind do its thing with a little bit of sense of distance, but also interest. So you can kind of look at it the way you'd look at a bug in a jar. Emotional openness, attentional flexibility from this more spiritual or observing sense of self, and values and committed action, that we can practice those things deliberately. And what it does is it takes the energy that's inside pathology, most of which is positive. We're not trying to screw up our lives. I mean, the reason we're just trying to get rid of anxiety is that we yearn to feel and we don't know how to feel bad stuff. You know, the reason why we put on a clown suit and pretend and lie and feign interest in others and all the other things we do is that we want to belong, we want to be connected, we want to be loved, and what it produces is disconnection. But that's not its purpose. And we can help people touch a sense of consciousness that will bring you into a deep communion with other people and really produce a genuine sense of belonging. But each of the inflexibility processes of the storied self, or cognitive entanglement, emotional avoidance, rumination and worry, putting your values on hold, and impulsivity or slogging on persistence, each of those inflexibility processes has a yearning inside it, a need, a motivation. And so what we're going to try to do in ACT is to not just retain a skill in isolation, but to show that it actually opens you up to the things we really yearn for, which I think are these big six of belonging and coherence and feeling and orientation and self-directed meaning and competence. Those big six underlying yearnings or needs are what we're trying to do when we do the things that screw us up. And it's what we actually can get when we start doing the things that the science shows moves your life forward. And so that's kind of where we focus our practice attempts, is on the steps that take you in a different direction, but actually give you what you've wanted all along anyway.
What are the most common obstacles or missteps that prevent therapists and patients alike from seeing the full benefits of ACT?
Well, I think, the mind is a pretty clever little organ, and its problem-solving repertoire is really way, way, way overdeveloped in the modern world. And so people start trying to understand ACT. That's fine. That's fine. I mean, with your science hat on, it's absolutely fine, and we're willing to play that game. But understanding can also be a booby prize if it overwhelms processes that go beyond this logical, analytical, judgmental mode of mind, into modes of mind and ways of being that are broader and touch things that are more intuitive and felt and learned by trial and error and experience that go beyond words, or this use of mind that's more like what you would know to do if you saw a sunset tonight, where you just appreciate it and maybe describe it. Look at how pink it is, but you wouldn't judge it. You're not going to say, oh God, that cloud needs to be a different shape. You just go, wow, and you'd appreciate and maybe describe. Well, that mode of mind exists, but it gets overwhelmed by the analytic, judgmental, figure out, predict, control, problem solve mode of mind. And that happens to therapists doing ACT. What is exactly the distinction between this and that? Well, it turns out it's not like that. It's not like we're discovering rocks on the ground. We're just talking to orient us towards different features of an integrated experience. And the distinctions are not as clear as your mind wants, because they're all interrelated. In the same way, people will do things like this. Hey, when I opened up to my emotions, I really said, okay, I'm not running anymore. And I really focused on what my body was doing and noticing what thoughts were coming up with this sort of sense of equanimity. Man, my anxiety just went down. So what I need to do is be more accepting so that my anxiety will go down. You just put your finger back into the wall socket. But it's so freaking logical, because you've experienced when you let go, you show up. I mean, I'm a panic disorder person in recovery. You talk to the people who've gone through panic disorder, almost every single one of them at times were panic lifted. And what happened is they got so fed up. They got they got to this point of, okay, kill me if you're gonna. And then the cloud lifts. And I'm like, oh, I've got a solution. Kill me if you're gonna. Kill me if you're gonna. It's not working anymore. No, dude, that first kill me if you're gonna was a true act of giving up. This other stuff is problem-solving manipulation in which you're looking at anxiety as something that really has to go away or else. Well, then anxiety is something to be anxious about, isn't it? Because or else is something that would make anyone anxious. So now I've got this self-amplifying loop from this new evolutionary adaptation called human language, symbolic thought, sitting on top processes that are 1,000 times more ancient. Operant classical conditioning is 500 million years old. Language, 2.8 million, maybe 200,000, depending if the hominins did it. So we're just babies playing around with these cognitive processes, and it's easy to get hooked again because we don't stop talking. You just slow down and do your meditation retreat, and you'd be shocked at how much self-talk is going on constantly.
That's definitely true for me. Can you share a poignant example where ACT had a major impact in someone's life? Of course, without sharing any identifying information.
Well, there's so many, and I'm so fortunate at my age where I get these moving emails almost every day from people around the world who have been moved by the work. But actually, what I'm thinking of is a particular person who sent me a note who had been in a workshop of mine, and I pushed him a little bit on his kind of acceptance skills and so forth. He had volunteered for a real play, I call it, not role play, where you want to come up and really work on something, work on it together. And I got a note a few weeks later that he'd gone home and had an email show up that his dad had died. And he said, man, everything in me would have told me, don't go to the funeral. You don't need to do that. It's just going to be dumb. It'd be tears. Some of the family members I'm not even like. Do I even want to do that? But I decided to go. And we laughed and we cried and we remembered and we cried again and laughed again at the funny things he did. And I gave a talk about how important he was in my life. And I just want to thank you. You taught me how to leap. I didn't know I was going to have to leap off the top of a building, but I'm glad I did. So I guess that example occurs just because, the things we're doing, even the people who are listening to this right now, that help us become more fully who we are, put our feet on the ground. We actually have a word for it. We call it being humble. It comes from the word humus. It means dirt, feet in the ground, where you get this kind of humble reality of, I don't get to be the one that says what's going to happen next, but I do get to be the one who puts their feet on the ground and who's prepared to be whole as life throws me curveballs. And that's the game here. And that's the invitation. I mean, that's what evidence-based therapy has to deliver, I think, is increased capacity for human beings to be whole and free, to be more fully who they are, and to live inside the cacophony of the modern world in a way that's healthy.
So that leads me to my next question. What are you most excited about in mental health treatment today?
Well, I have to admit the things I'm most excited about are the things I'm doing. And so I could answer, where am I trying to take this work? One is I'm trying to take it towards process-based therapy. Instead of defining so much by protocols, I find if you want to call things ACT, but don't define it as a protocol route, define it as a model of processes. If you wanted to call it psychological flexibility instead of ACT, I'd be equally happy with that. But with my colleague Stefan Hoffman, who was an early and vigorous opponent of ACT, and we debated so many times that we became really close and dear friends, we're trying to put a focus on processes instead of on signs and symptoms of syndromes. The 5 out of 9s and the 4 out of 7s of things that are in the DSM are not what human beings asked for. The only people who asked for that were academic psychiatry and their allies, and it's failed. The psychiatrist, academic psychiatry knows it's failed. The medical system knows it's failed. NIMH doesn't even want to fund it anymore. But it's not clear what the alternative is, and I think the alternative is to abandon a latent disease model, instead go to processes of change and try to collect the processes that are most powerful. So I'm excited by that because it breaks down the walls between all these traditions, these silly kind of things. Oh, I'm a humanist. Oh, I'm an existentialist. Oh, I'm a cognitivist. Oh, I'm a behaviorist. Oh, I mean, grow up. There isn't any mature field of endeavor that does that. There's no physics out there where people are saying, ooh, I'm a phlogiston person. I mean, what are you talking about? I mean, people are hanging on to distinctions that are just not what we need. So what I want to do is bring together, and there's different philosophies, different assumptions, I get that, but bring together people who are evidence-based with a focus on processes of change. And I want to do it in a way that lands ideographically, that actually meets the needs of individuals, because it turns out to do that process-based focus inside a collective way misdirects you. There is no average process of change. It doesn't exist. But processes of change can be studied ideographically, and then we can come up with nomothetic generalizations. And so that combination of a process-focused and coming back to the individuals we serve, or the couples and families, I'm not saying individuals in social isolation, but I mean not taking a collective to be a person. It's not. When you have two arms of randomized trials, you don't have two people. You have collections of people. And that makes a big difference in how we have to think about things scientifically and practically. Part of what I'm doing inside the PBT work, the process-based therapy work, is also trying to find a way to have an overarching umbrella that will produce consilience across these many different wings of intervention. And the one that we're proposing is to do it inside an extended evolutionary synthesis. And so far, the scientists like it in almost every area. Almost everyone thinks that what they're doing should somehow fit inside Darwinian thinking writ large. And in every other area of the life sciences, that's true. I mean, there's in every area of the life sciences where if you ask why, and then they answer it, and then you'll say, why that? And then you answer it, and they say, well, why that? By about the third question, they're going to say evolution. And you could talk from now to next Tuesday to an average psychotherapist, and they'll never say evolution. And that's just wrong, because we're evolving systems. And evolution is not just genes. It's learning. It's epigenes. It's environment, behavior. It's social support. It's attachment. I mean, all those things are actually altering even how our genes are expressed. And so that is the other one I'm excited about. Can we produce consilience by a more process-based focus, relevance by making it more ideographic, and put it together where the behavioral sciences get to be part of the life sciences writ large by putting it under the umbrella of an extended evolutionary synthesis, a multidimensional, multi-level evolutionary account.
So if you had a magic wand and it could improve one thing about mental health treatment, what would it be?
Well, one would be to stop thinking of it as mental health treatment, because mental health is a metaphor, right? And it's not too far away from mental disease. And that's really been a bad player. That is a bad actor. Health, okay. Mental health, I guess, okay, but be careful. Now, if what you mean by that is psychological health, if we mean by that is behavioral health, what you mean by that is empowering people to step up to the challenges of their life in ways that allow them to be more and more whole and free, to be effective human beings, then I'm down with that. I'm with that, absolutely. But part of what's cool about the ACT work is these same processes that are in acceptance and commitment therapy or in what we call acceptance and commitment training. Why do we call it that? Because if you're doing organizational consulting, you don't want to say we're doing therapy. If you're working with an Olympic sports team, you don't want to say we're doing therapy. But I was in the Rio Olympics and I saw people who win gold medals, using ACT. I mean, I know who their coaches are. I know what they were doing. So can we think instead of mental health treatment, which produces all this stigma and resistance, et cetera? Can we think of psychological empowerment, of how do we help people step up to the challenge of the modern world, which is getting harder and harder? Maybe that computer in your pocket will expose you to horror if something happens in the next minute. By the time we finish our conversation, which is only a couple minutes from now, you can see it on your freaking iPhone. And not just that, you can hear the judgmental criticisms about how it should have not happened because. And if you want to compare yourself to others, you can go into the bathrooms of the rich and famous and look at their gold-plated doorknobs. And that combination of pain and judgment and comparison is a toxic triad. it's about as harmful as you can get in the human consciousness. And we've fed it accidentally by our own science and technology. So I think we need to stop thinking about mental illness, mental health. I need to start thinking about mental prosperity, mental flexibility, mental empowerment. I'm fine with the word mental if you want to use it as a metaphor for talking about the whole range of psychological functions. But health gets too close to illness, and illness is we're into disease. And there we are, once again, chasing our 5 out of 9s and 4 out of 7s.
That makes a lot of sense. How can my audience learn more about your work, either online or in print?
Well, if they're willing to get emails from me, not too spammy, but just go to stephenchayes.com. And when you enter into that funnel and give up your email address, well, then you get newsletters from me and things like that. But the ACT world is pretty vast. And so if you just put in acceptance and commitment therapy or acceptance and commitment training or psychological flexibility, you'll find a vast array of free resources, online groups, and books and so forth that are really quite inexpensive, many of which have been validated. We've validated Get Out of Your Mind and Your Life, my book, 3 or 4 times. And so in randomized trials and so forth. So if something I've said in here is of interest, I would check out my website, and I hope you buy my new book. COI warning, I get royalties. But also look at the vast range of resources that are out there. And even beyond that, I mean, the work on acceptance and mindfulness and values has a consilience to it. Just those terms will help you get close to that work if you're interested in it.
And all of those resources will be linked on our website at therapyshow.com. So Dr. Hayes, on behalf of myself, my listeners, and all of the people that you have helped through your work, I want to thank you for your contributions to mental health treatment and for taking the time out of your busy schedule to help me and my audience better understand the field of acceptance and commitment therapy.
I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for the opportunity to share it with others.
I'd like to close by reminding our listeners to please subscribe, share, and review this podcast so that you, someone you love, and people around the world can benefit more from therapies like ACT. There is no need to suffer in silence. Get the help that you need to create the life that you want.